Ebony and Ivy: Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities. And with that said, welcome to the show, Professor Craig James Wilder.
Nice to meet you. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you taking time out of your NFL Sunday to hang out with the Dean on Dean family. And the first thing that I want to ask you is, how did you begin your journey in writing Ebony and Ivy?
It began about 11 years ago, and I was honestly actually just looking for a small topic. I had just finished a second book, and excuse me, I had decided to write a history explaining how black abolitionists, the free African Americans who opposed slavery in the decades before the Civil War, how they managed to become professionals, given the fact that they were excluded from colleges and universities. And I really ended up, as I started that research, and I ended up becoming much more interested in the fact that, or in how these universities actually operated and sustained and supported and influenced the perpetuation of slavery and the very racial civilization that was excluding black people from higher education.
Very good. And let me ask you this. As a matter of fact, let's just get started with the specific schools, and let's start with the Ivy League schools. Say Harvard, and tell us about Harvard's ties to chattel slavery.
Well, I think from the very beginning of the college, Harvard is founded in 1636 here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and 2 years later, there is an enslaved black man who's named the Moor living on campus, and so one of the early residents of Harvard Yard is an enslaved person.
And you said they called him the Moor?
The Moor, yeah, M-O-O-R. And
okay.
He probably arrives as part of an exchange of some sort, either a sale or exchange. The Pequot War had just ended the year before, and Harvard had actually benefited from the war with land grants when the Puritans actually defeated the Pequot Indians. Harvard gains land at the end of the war. But it's also true that the Massachusetts Puritans end up capturing and imprisoning a significant number of Pequot, particularly women and children, who were sold into to Bermuda and the West Indies. And that ship, the ship that leaves, is probably the first slaving vessel to leave New England, and it returns with enslaved Africans. And so he's likely a product of that moment. And so from the very beginning of the college, in fact, the dawn of slavery in New England, I write in the book, is also the birth of slavery at Harvard.
Very good. And tell us about the Mathers family that was involved with Harvard University, too, please.
The Mathers?
Yes.
The Mathers, going back to Richard, are one of the old New England Puritan families and one of the key families in establishing the intellectual tradition of the Puritans. Richard Mather is an early migrant from England to New England as part of the large Puritan migration. His son, Increase Mather, also a minister, serves in the presidency of Harvard and represents Harvard in England at one point. And his son, Cotton Mather, probably the greatest of the Puritan intellectuals, is a Harvard graduate and one of the key intellectual figures of New England. And if you look at the Mathers, when Increase Mather is the president of Harvard, his congregation had actually given him a black child as a gift. And that young boy man is actually used on campus to run errands for the president while Increase Mather is the president of Harvard. Cotton Mather also gets a black child as a gift from his congregation, and he uses him for the same kinds of errands. And in fact, actually, if you look at the long history of Harvard, from the arrival of the Moor in 1638, this black man who's enslaved on campus, through the 18th century, one of the striking features is the close, intimate relationship between the college, its governors, and slavery and the slave trade. A lot of the trustees are slave owners. And as Harvard emerges, and you have to think about Harvard as a tiny, small colonial college, which is struggling to survive in the 17th century, as it gains stability and prominence, its stability actually parallels the growing economy of New England, which is an economy that's built upon supplying the West Indies in the South, the slave plantations to the South, with the food and the products that they need to maintain plantation agriculture.
Absolutely. The call-in number is 646-200-0067. And you said something very interesting. You said that children were given to some of these people in the Mathers family. And I wanted to ask you this question. Many of the earlier university presidents, they were also slave owners, and many of them purchased children. In what capacity did they use these children? And I'm sure it wasn't just to run errands.
No, it's not just to run errands. The children are often purchased as household slaves, and therefore they're purchased for domestic work. Some of them are used on campus. At Harvard, Benjamin Wadsworth, an 18th century president of Harvard, his slave Titus, a black man named Titus, is actually used on campus to do all sorts of work, both in the president's house and on the campus. But Titus also is used by the students for various forms of entertainment, to a point where the trustees, the governors, eventually banned Titus from the campus. They blame him for the mischief of the students. And so there's an interesting thing that happens with children, particularly in the Northeast. And one of the things I struggled with in the book was that pattern that you describe of college presidents and others throughout the Northeast, both the Mid-Atlantic and New England, purchasing children. And this becomes particularly prominent in the 18th century, in the 1700s. I just recognized, I saw a pattern of this kind of commerce, and some of these children are quite small. There's a ship that I examine in the book where, there are 2- and 3-year-olds being held on board on the African coast, and that ship is actually heading back toward New York. It's owned by a prominent New Yorker who becomes a founder of both Columbia University, which was then King's College, and Princeton, which was then the College of New Jersey. And so we're talking about very small children at one point. And one of the things I wrestled with in the book was how to explain this. And in part, actually, I began to see, and I came to understand, supported by the research of actually a lot of historians, that the part of the explanation for this is the slave revolts that had taken place and the large slave conspiracies that had taken place in the Northeast. If you want to think about New York City, for example, in 1712, there's a large slave revolt in which the enslaved Africans rise up and end up killing probably about a dozen white people. And in 1741, there's a massive conspiracy that rocks the city to its foundations. New Yorkers, like their peers, and white New Yorkers like their peers in New Jersey and Connecticut and Massachusetts, begin to actually show a preference for children in the 18th century, for purchasing children, who they think will be more easily socialized into the routine of slavery and less likely to revolt. And so you can actually follow this emerging commerce in young children in particular in the 18th century. And, according to instruments like the Slave Trade Database, probably about 20% of the people transported from the African coast into the Americas as slaves were children.
So they wanted children versus the men, because I believe personally that the original people that came from Africa, they weren't slaves, they were prisoners. And it was much harder to break down a grown man or a grown woman. So getting the children over, they can just more easily indoctrinate them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You can actually see it certainly by the middle of the 18th century. There's an open preference for children. And in fact, actually, some Northerners are actually writing about it, particularly Northerners who engaged in the slave trade itself. I give examples in the book of letters that are sent between various slave traders advising actually that they transport children because the preference for the region is children. And you're absolutely right. It's the belief is that the children will be more easily socialized, less likely to revolt, and better suited to the applications of their labor that are going to happen in the sort of northeastern colonies.
Very good. And you wrote in your book, the Academy never stood apart from American slavery. In fact, it stood beside church and state as the third pillar of a civilization built on bondage. What did you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. What I meant is when, by the time I had finished the project, when I really, after, 10 years of writing, and in that final year where you're just sort of editing, you're making small changes here and there, and you're going back and forth with the editors to sort of, just finalize the language. That sentence sort of, for me, captured what I had learned over the past decade. And what I had learned over the past decade is that we often, in fact, talk about the role of the church and the state, the government, be it the British government or the governments of the American colonies, the colonial governments, the role of the government and the church in defending slavery and perpetuating slavery. But what I wanted to remind readers is that slavery also acquired an extraordinary intellectual justification, and that justification was actually largely refined on campus. It was crafted on campus. And the colleges, therefore, play a key role in defending and perpetuating human slavery in the modern world. And we actually have to take responsibility for that. We have to be as honest about ourselves and our own institutions as we are when we investigate the relationship between the presidency and slavery. We've written about Thomas Jefferson and slavery and George Washington and slavery, the Presbyterian Church and the Quakers and slavery. We've written about the law and slavery, and we have to be as honest when we talk about and think about the academy and slavery and the role that the academy played, which by the 19th century is certainly as pronounced as the church or the state in both defending and perpetuating human bondage.
Absolutely. And let me ask you this as well, Professor Wilder. And you talk about scientific racism, which we now know today as being eugenics. Were these early universities conduits for eugenics and, like you just stated, legitimizing slavery and saying that African Americans were less than?
Yeah. What I do in the book is I actually begin the first part of the book is actually titled, part one is titled Slavery and the Rise of the American College, and the second part is Race and the Rise of the American College. And what I try to do there is actually show that the ideas of race actually emerged in the violent, brutal world of slavery and conquest. It's precisely in the destruction of Native American civilizations over centuries and in the rise of the African slave trade and African slavery over centuries that ideas about the biological capacities of human beings begin to emerge. The role that the college and the university plays on both sides of the Atlantic, both the colonial colleges that we're talking about and the great European universities, the role that those institutions play is they actually become the centers, the headquarters for refining those ideas and giving them intellectual legitimacy, particularly through the rise of science, through the rise of what we see as modern sort of scientific processes and techniques. And so the young Americans in the middle of the 18th century, in the 1750s and 1760s, are actually flooding into European schools. Kids from the boys, teenagers are in their early 20s, from colonies like Virginia and New Jersey, Barbados and Jamaica, are going to Britain to study science and to study medicine. And these young men actually are from some of the most privileged families in the American colonies, often slaveholding families and slave trading families. In Europe, they become experts on race. They become experts on colored people. They're often
what do you mean by experts? What do you mean by experts?
They emerge on the other side of the Atlantic as people who have expertise, immediate, intimate relationships and experiences with Native Americans and Africans. And so they're invited to do things like, for instance, one young man from Virginia gives a lecture on vitiligo. It's not called that at the time, but the skin discolorization in black people. Another actually gives a lecture on the prevalence of albinism among Native Americans. They emerge in the European Academy as young colonials, but also as experts, people who have intimate relationships with and experiences with people of color, Africans and Native Americans in the Atlantic world. These young men also write dissertations when they're in school, in medical school. And I was in Scotland and London and in Scotland and England and France and the Netherlands, reading some of the dissertations and going through some of them to see what they were working on. And very often they're working on questions like the course of disease among African people or Native American people in the Americas. But even more importantly, this is the group of young men who come back to the American colonies after their medical school training, now as doctors, and they establish the first medical programs in the North American colonies. The very first medical school was at the College of Philadelphia, which is now the University of Pennsylvania. And they established a medical school there. The second one is at King's College, which is now Columbia, New York. And in both cases, the work of establishing the medical school rests upon the ability to access bodies to research on. And accessing bodies means, in fact, very often, accessing the corpses of enslaved black people, or, in fact, researching upon the bodies of living slaves.
Okay, so medical practice, I guess that's where they get the term, we're going to practice medicine, I guess. Yeah, I mean, this is a perverse form of practicing upon humans. Now, the enslaved and Native Americans aren't the only people who are treated in this way. In the British universities, it's often, in fact, the marginalized people of Britain, the Irish and the Scots, who will get preyed upon by the rising medical research structure. In the Americas, it's Africans, it's Native Americans, and often or frequently marginalized groups like the Irish. But what's clear is that the rise of medical science requires a violation of the persons of the poor and the oppressed. Yeah. And so slavery played a complicit role in these universities mastering their sciences when it comes to medicine. Yeah. The bodies of enslaved people are critical from the very beginnings, and you can see this. I have a couple of chapters that actually look at the rise of the sciences, and I look at the sciences for a specific reason. That the law programs are also being established at roughly the same time, but in many ways the law is already an instrument of state power. It's an expression of governmental power. What I was interested in the sciences was that the sciences actually provide something new to the transatlantic discourse about race. The sciences ultimately provide a kind of academic or secular legitimacy, a secular defense of slavery, as they get co-opted into the defense of slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Very good. And I just want to share this with the listening audience. There's a fantastic book called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. And it's a fascinating read. I think you guys should go check it out. It talks about the experimentation on African Americans from colonial times up to this very day. So there's nothing new under the sun. Professor Water, let me ask you this. Did slave labor build many of these universities?
It did. We know this story at places like the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's intellectual monument and the histories of the University of Virginia give, in fact, in extraordinary detail the use of enslaved people to raise these monuments. We know it in Washington, D.C., about the monumental architecture of Washington, D.C., and the role that enslaved black people played in building the nation's capital. The University of Virginia, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, very similarly. But the same thing can be said of many northern institutions. At Brown University, which was then the College of Rhode Island, the subscriptions for the university after it gets its charter, when people begin donating money, one of the things they donate is actually the labor of their slaves to help build the institution.
Oh, wow.
So they donate money, they donate goods like wood and nails, but they also donate the labor of their slaves. At Dartmouth College, when Eleazar Wheelock, the founder of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, gets his charter in 1769, he shows up in New Hampshire the following year with 8 enslaved black people. And I write in the book that an honest accounting of it leaves us with something that we have to wrestle with. He probably has more slaves. He certainly has more slaves than he has faculty. He has more slaves than he has active trustees, and he probably has more slaves than he actually has students. And as he writes in his own narrative of the early history of Dartmouth, which was a fundraising tool, the slaves were actually doing much of the work of building the rough set of buildings that are, in fact, the origins of Dartmouth College.
Very good. Professor Water, we're coming up against a break. Could you stick around with us for a few more minutes? And I want to ask you some questions about Dartmouth, particularly since you work there.
Okay, absolutely.
Okay, very good. You guys are listening to the Dean O'Dean Show, Hollaback Radio.
I'm Wayne Brady, and I've got something that will truly revolutionize your life. It's called Exercise. It will get you from here to there, allow you to spend time with your family and meet new people. Oh, cut inches from your waistline, even help improve your self-image. So when you've got to choose between moving around or lying on the couch, choose exercise. Call the Will Rogers Institute today to learn more about this exciting new activity. Exercise is available in all 50 states and the District of Columbia and comes in 28 great flavors.
We were a fairly conservative family in La Cañada, which is close to Pasadena and the Rose Bowl. My father was a federal judge, highly regarded. I was in the Peace Corps in Costa Rica. Then I went back for 3 years of law school at USC and then was a Navy JAG attorney for 4 years. Then I was appointed to the bench. I had the guidance of my father. I'd been a trial attorney for quite a while, and that really felt like the right thing. It became immediately apparent to me when I was a judge, watching what was going on in my own courtroom, that we were churning low-level drug offenders through the system for no good purpose. There are mandatory minimum sentences, and there have been times in which I've known of judges, federal, state, are literally in tears because they know that this sentence is inappropriate. And so they would apologize to people, but as they're sending them to prison for 10 years, they know full well it really shouldn't even be a prison sentence, or maybe 1 or 2 years, but they have to follow the law. We, in the United States of America, contrary to virtually every country that I'm aware of, have focused on jails, focused on prisons. We lead the world in the incarceration of our people, both by sheer numbers as well as per capita. It's extremely expensive, both in financial terms as well as human terms. We have to get smart on crime instead of tough on crime. Probation, mental health facilities, strict accountability, quicker justice. Let's make drug treatment more available for people, and we won't need all of these prisons. We simply can't afford it, and it doesn't work.
Welcome back to the Dino Dean Show. The call-in number is 646-200-0067. Once again, the call-in number is 646-200-0067. And on air with me is a history professor from MIT University, Professor Craig James Wilder, and he has written a fantastic book, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities. Professor Wilder, are you still with us?
I am. It's Craig Stephen Wilder, but it's... Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
no, that's fine. No problem.
That's what professors are for. You correct your students. Very good. Let me ask you this. You taught at Dartmouth University, correct?
I did.
Okay. And how did you feel working at Dartmouth, knowing that some of the dark history of Dartmouth? Was it difficult? Did you feel you wanted to move on, or is either here nor there?
It's a great question. I think, this book started out of an interest. It was an interest in, as I said before, I wanted to sort of see how black abolitionism, how this sort of very radical challenge to slavery could emerge when black people had been so thoroughly excluded from higher education, and in fact their access to both higher education and even education was under attack at the high point of their movement. And under violent attack at the high point of the black abolitionist movement. And so for me, it was really an academic interest. I have attended these schools. I actually have 3 degrees from schools that are in this book. I've got an honorary degree from Dartmouth, and I taught at Dartmouth for several years. I taught at Williams for several years, and Williams is in the book. And I teach at MIT now, and MIT is in the book.
Okay.
It's
you're telling on everybody.
I actually, and my goal with the book is not to, this is not an attack on any of these institutions. And so, in many ways, actually, I love my education. My education allowed me and my sisters to go from being poor kids living in the inner city of Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, with a single mother who was working 2 jobs to give us a chance to go to school, to becoming professionals, to becoming, my sister's a pediatrician, I'm a college professor, my oldest sister worked for the NYPD for many years. It gave us a chance to change. These schools gave us a chance to change our lives. And so I love these institutions. And so the book didn't change the way that I think about or feel at any of them. I was at Dartmouth and at MIT for most of the time all of the time that I was writing this book. It didn't change the way I feel about the institution personally. It did change the way I think about them as a historian. And I think in part, it's important for me as a scholar, as somebody who teaches on these campuses and spends much of his life on these campuses, to remember that there was a black presence from the very beginning, that these institutions aren't possible without a black presence, that enslaved black people actually sacrificed mightily to give rise to these institutions that many of us now kind of benefit from and cherish. Now, I also think that these institutions, for that reason, have a moral obligation to examine their histories and be honest about those histories, and to actually respond to that history in very real ways.
Let me ask you this, Professor Wilder. You say you feel that these institutions have a responsibility to look at their history. Do you also feel that they have a responsibility to help educate the descendants of Africans here in America? Do you feel that these universities should do more as far as scholarships for African American students?
Yeah, let's actually take a concrete example. When Brown University did the 2006 Brown and Slavery report on Brown and slavery, President Ruth Simmons showed extraordinary courage. As the first non-white president of an Ivy League institution, she showed extraordinary courage in commissioning that report and putting together that committee in 2003. When the report was released in 2006, she showed extraordinary courage in releasing it to the public. And then in stepping up before the alumni, the trustees, the current students, and the faculty, and making an argument for the obligation of academics to pursue the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. All these years later, I would argue that Brown is a better institution because of the work that she did and the work that committee did. Where I'm disappointed is that Brown's peer institutions didn't do the same thing. After the Brown report was released in 2006, I was working on this project basically for about 4 years by that time, and I expected actually a rush of reports coming from all of these institutions. In fact, part of me, I was thinking, good, I can get out of this project, which was already taking more time than I had actually anticipated.
Right.
And there was nothing. What has happened since has been the work of students and faculty and museum curators and librarians and archivists on these campuses have taken up the work of actually exploring the relationship between these institutions and slavery. But the upper administrations have actually been very slow to do the same thing. Brown has moved forward to implement real responses to its history with slavery and the slave trade, including, as you point out, both a Center for the Study of Race and Slavery, a recommitment to education and to really funding students. And I think for each of the institutions, the solution, the response will be different. But there needs to be a response. There needs to be an engagement with the past. And I say that in that way just because their histories are different. When you actually look at them, it's not one story for every institution. For instance, Dartmouth has a deep, complex history with Native Americans and a deep, complex history with African Americans. And its responses to that history will end up being different than the ones that, for instance, Columbia might have. But I think each institution does have absolutely a moral obligation to be as honest with its past as it can be, and then to respond to that past. And we need not fear it. I mean, I think too much of the conversation is driven by fear, and it needs to be driven by a sense of integrity. For us to be the institutions that we claim to be, we actually have to have the integrity to pursue our own history as honestly and openly as we can, whatever the political consequences of it.
Absolutely. And tell us about Dartmouth's history with Native Americans.
Well, Eleazar Wheelock, the founder of Dartmouth, the Reverend Eleazar Wheelock, began his career as a missionary and educator to Native Americans in Connecticut. He ran a Connecticut Indian school, Indian Academy, which started in his home, basically, for decades before he became the founder of Dartmouth College. He had gone to Yale College, and at Yale he had actually gotten a scholarship, funding, basically, to pursue his education that was for training missionaries to Native Americans, and he did that work for quite some time. The money that he raised to establish Dartmouth College, and that he used to establish, I should say the money he used to establish Dartmouth College, much of it had actually been raised by the Reverend Samson Occom, his first Native American student, famous Native American minister, and Occom had actually raised the money in England, 10 or 12,000 pounds at the time, to help the Indian Academy and to advance Native American education. But much of that actually ended up being used to establish Dartmouth. And at Dartmouth, Wheelock quickly sort of begins educating white students. The few Native American students who were there at the time are largely in what would be called a grammar school and not in the college program. And so, part of the history that Dartmouth has wrestled with over the past 200 or more years is its origins as a Native American institution and its emergence as a historically white college. In 1969, at the 200th anniversary, the then president of Dartmouth made, in fact, a very real recommitment to Native American studies and Native American education. And so on the campus now, one of the things I most enjoyed when I was a faculty member at Dartmouth is there's an extraordinarily good Native American studies program and a real commitment to funding Native American students. And so I had, in fact, a significant number of Native students while I was at Dartmouth. And I learned a lot from working next to one of the best Native American studies programs in the nation.
Very good. I find it interesting that you stated that those monies to Dartmouth were originally supposed to go for the Native Americans, yet the bulk of it went to European Americans, but there was a grammar school set up for Native Americans, once again, indoctrinating the children.
Yeah, my colleague Colin Calloway described it very neatly as Colin is a extraordinary historian of Native Americans. Described it as Reverend Wheelock had developed a preference for white Indians and young students in particular. And by white Indians, he means the Native Americans who had significant mixed ancestry from the southern part of Canada by the time that Wheelock had established Dartmouth. That's the group that he was looking to educate.
And what year was Dartmouth established?
It was established in 1769. And Wheelock had decided that group of Native Americans of mixed race would actually take better to Christian education, but in fact, actually, one of the other things that's true about that moment is that the students, the Native students, are increasingly young and few, and fairly quickly, in fact, the Native American presence at Dartmouth disappears, as Colin notes in his book on Dartmouth. In the first 200 years of Dartmouth College, fewer than 20 Native Americans actually get a college degree, which is just a fairly poignant measure of how far Native American education had actually fallen out of the sort of mission of the institution.
Now, okay, very good. And let me ask you this as well. You tell us that many of the first presidents of these universities were ministers and missionaries. What's the significance of telling us that?
I think for a number of things. One of the things I argue in the very first chapter of the book is that part of the purpose of the Colonial College is to missionize Native Americans, to evangelize them, and to convert them to Christianity, to the branch of Christianity, whatever the local colonial background is. So,
Professor Water, let me just interrupt you briefly. Mm-hmm. Don't you find converting somebody to your religion, isn't that just an air of superiority to that? Your God's no good and my God is better than yours?
Well, sure. And one of the things I was trying to figure out in the book, which as I was doing the research for the book, was something that was actually confusing to me as a historian looking backward. In Virginia and in Massachusetts, probably the two most significant colonies that the English established on the mainland in the 17th century, mainland North America in the 17th century. In Virginia and in Massachusetts, within a decade of the arrival of the English colonists, they're attempting to establish colleges. And I found this quite peculiar, given, in fact, the hardships that were being suffered in both places. Just establishing themselves, defending themselves, establishing agriculture, and a way of actually just feeding themselves and maintaining the colony. The business of trying to raise a college at the same time seemed strange to me. But in both places, there are plans that are developed and fully underway for the establishment of a college. In Massachusetts, it's successful with the establishment of Harvard in 1636. In Virginia, it fails because the money is there, the charter is basically there, the land is there, but an Indian war breaks out, and it destroys the project. And so Virginia's first college is delayed until the very end of the century, and William and Mary will play that role at the end of the century. I was trying to figure out why they were doing this, given, in fact, the other immediate priorities that they had. And existential priorities to actually, maintaining and sustaining the colonies themselves. And I had to look to Scotland and Ireland in order to answer the question. And if you look at the centuries before English colonization of the Americas, and you watch the way that the English attempt to colonize Scotland and Ireland, you actually do see, in fact, colleges and universities being deployed in this same very militaristic way to root out the remnants of Catholicism in both regions and paganism in both regions, to bring the ruling class under the governance of the English crown, and to make it easier to govern these sort of satellite colonies. And so it's not peculiar, actually, that in the Americas, the English experiment in colonization of the Americas would also include the deployment of colleges in this very sort of militaristic way, in which spreading the faith would be, in fact, a means of both extending the government of God, the Christian God, but also pacifying and making it easier to govern foreign peoples.
Pacification, I thought that's where you would eventually go. And I just want to share this with the listening audience. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the 3M, as in Mary, theory. This is how Europeans conquered most lands when they went there. First they came as merchants, let me trade with you. Then they brought in the missionaries to pacify you. Then they brought in the mercenaries to do all of the killing and the taking of the land. I just wanted to share that's the 3M theory. And Professor Wilder, let's move on to Yale's involvement in slavery. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Yale is founded as the collegiate school in 1701, and I think it eventually makes its way. It's not founded in New Haven, Connecticut, but it's founded in Connecticut, but not in New Haven. And like Princeton, it sort of moves around in its early years. But slavery is there at the very beginning. In fact, actually, when the founders of the collegiate school, now Yale, meet, they're ministers from several towns. Come together. And as one historian of Yale points out, they arrive on horseback, followed by their men servants or their slaves. And so from the very beginnings of the institution, enslaved people are present at the very founding moment. The early rectors and presidents of the university were often slaveholders, including Thomas Clapp, the first person to actually hold the title president. Ezra Stiles, one of the most famous presidents of Yale, who successfully brings Yale through the Revolutionary War, was a slaveholder during his early life as a minister in Rhode Island. In fact, an example of something we were talking about earlier, he buys a young boy in Newport, Rhode Island from a slave ship captain and names him Newport. Yet another example of someone buying a child. Phyllis Wheatley is probably the most universally known example of that we have. But, and she's bought it about 7 or 8 years old right here in the Long Wharf in Boston. He holds Newport as a slave through adulthood and emancipates him the day before he leaves Rhode Island for New Haven to become the president of Yale. So Yale's relationship to slavery goes from the very beginning of the institution and then right through the 19th century and the Civil War. In the final chapter of the book, in which I look at the role that the Academy played in movements like colonization, the attempt to remove the free black population from the United States and relocate them somewhere outside the United States, either Haiti or a colony on West Africa, which is eventually settled upon as Liberia. In that movement, and when it reaches its peak, the vice president of the American Colonization Society, the president is James Madison, the former president of the United States, and the vice president is Jeremiah Day, the president of Yale. And academics are overrepresented in the movement to clear free black people from the United States and relocate them outside the country for multiple reasons. By the 1830s, in particular, when Day is the vice president of the Colonization Society and president of Yale, the motivations are, in fact, increasingly aggressive, and it's an anti-black agenda. It's a desire to see black people, or to racially homogenize the United States, but also to remove free black people as a voice of protest against slavery.
Interesting. And in the movie 12 Years a Slave, that did let a lot of people who didn't know that there were free people here in the Americas, free black people. So part of the movement to send people to Liberia was to stop resistance to slavery via African Americans. I didn't know that.
And we have to remember just how intense the campaign against free black people becomes. And Yale is actually a pretty good lens for understanding this. I had mentioned Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, who emancipated his enslaved man Newport the day before he became the president of Yale, before he moved into the president's house in New Haven. Ezra Stiles arrives in New Haven, and he actually begins ministering to the black population. As legend has it, when he purchased Newport as a child, one evening, I believe it is, or afternoon, he walks into the kitchen of his house, and he sees the boy sitting at the table crying. And at that moment, Stiles actually recognized what he had done, the human damage that he had done. He had actually taken a child from his family and community and broken those ties forever. And as legend has it, Stiles decided to give Newport a Christian education. He kept him as a slave and educated him. He emancipates him the day before he arrives in New Haven, but in New Haven, Stiles actually does some rather interesting things. He establishes the Connecticut Abolition Society. He becomes the president of that association. Several Yale faculty are actually on the association. The calendar of the Abolition Society, Anti-Slavery Society, is parallel to the university calendar, and so it meets with the university, and so it really is, in fact, a kind of informal arm of the university.
So he went from slaveholder to abolitionist.
Yeah, and anti-slavery and slavery actually live in a tense relationship on campus. The moral debate of slavery is actually happening at the same time that slaves are present, and the slave trade is helping to fund many of these institutions. And that's part of the sort of paradox of the troubled relationship between colleges, universities, and slavery. As places where theology and science got refined and critiqued, ultimately colleges and universities couldn't avoid the topic of slavery. And as places that were benefiting from slavery and the slave trade, there was, in fact, intense pressure for them to avoid that topic. And so that's just part of the contradiction of their lives and their emergence. But, just a few decades later, after Stiles has helped to establish an anti-slavery tradition within Connecticut, the faculty and the officers, the upper administration of Yale, including President Day, but also people like Benjamin Silliman, the famous chemistry professor of Yale and a Yale graduate, they're overwhelmingly supportive of the colonization campaign, and they're increasingly using deeply divisive, racist language, passionately racist language, to defend the project of voluntarily or forcibly removing free black people from the North American mainland.
Wow. Professor Wilder, we're going to go to the phone lines right now, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Area code 708-351. Talk to me. It's Dino Dean. Did you have a question or a comment for Professor Wilder?
No, I'm good. I'm just listening to it. I just tuned in. How y'all doing today?
Everybody's doing fine. Hey, thanks for tuning in via telephone. I appreciate it. Let's move on to Princeton, Professor Wilder. What was Princeton's role with the slave trade?
Yeah, it's, I think it's similar. What happens in the 18th century, in the 1700s, is, we've been talking about roughly three colleges for the most part: Harvard, William and Mary, and Yale. And Harvard is founded in 1636, William and Mary in 1693, Yale in 1701. But then there's something that is really quite incredible happens in the middle of the 18th century. Between 1746 and 1769, 23 years, 6 new colleges get established. Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth all get established in that period, or the number of colleges in the mainland British colonies triples from 3 to 9. And the reason why that is important to us, the reason that's important in the book, is that that's precisely the moment when the African slave trade is peaking.
Mm-hmm.
And these colleges are largely being founded in the active slave trading centers of the Northeast ports, and in the regions that are supplying the plantations of the South and the West Indies with everything from the fruit and vegetables and fish that they eat, the salted pork and dried beef, and all of the provisioning trade that actively sustains the plantations of the South and the West Indies. And so Princeton is the first of that group. It's founded in 1646 in New Jersey. It has close ties to many of the major slaveholding and slave trading families of the Mid-Atlantic region. Its board includes a significant number of slave traders. That's also true at the University of Pennsylvania, which is then the College of Philadelphia, and Columbia, which is then King's College, and as Brown pointed out in its own report, the College of Rhode Island. It was then the College of Rhode Island. Probably has more slave traders on the board than any other college. But the other thing that I found interesting about Princeton was that because Princeton is established as a Presbyterian college, a college with Presbyterian affiliation, and we have to remember that the early colleges are denominational schools. So if Harvard is Puritan, then Princeton is Presbyterian, Columbia is Anglican, Brown is Baptist, Rutgers is Dutch Reformed, part of the Dutch Reformed Church. Because Princeton is Presbyterian, there's a whole Presbyterian network in colonial America that the college ultimately comes to use to help sustain itself, to find both students and sources of support. But that means that Princeton is branching out and reaching out into the slaveholding plantations of the South and the slave plantations of the West Indies in search of students and donors. One of the places you can see this is in 1768 when John Witherspoon, the president who brings Princeton, the minister who brings Princeton through the Revolutionary War, comes from Scotland to take over what is then the struggling College of New Jersey, now Princeton. Witherspoon arrives in 1768, and he quickly gets to the business of forming new relationships and searching for new sources of money. And he publishes just a few years later a missive to the West Indies in which he declares that the very name of a West Indian has come to mean great wealth. And that flattery is just introduction to a request for money and students and a promise that Princeton will, that the faculty at Princeton, the faculty at the College of New Jersey, will carefully mentor, take care of, and educate the wealthy young sons of the plantation elite of the West Indies and the South. And so these colleges are emerging not just with, environmental ties to slavery. They're not just colleges that happen to be established in slave societies or slave trading regions. They're actually colleges that are aggressively pursuing the slave economy as a source of students and wealth.
Very good. We're going to go back to the phone lines right now. Area code 347-274. Talk to me. It's Dino Dean.
Hey, what's up, Dino Dean? How you doing, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. What's going on?
Okay, nothing much. I just got a two-part question to the gentleman. He's dropping some science, and I wanted to know, do he know anything about the Native American Vaccine Act in the 1700s due to the smallpox that was given to them, to the indigenous Indians by the general for germ warfare, number one.
Okay.
And number two, do he believe that the vaccines that they're giving the Africans over there in Africa is the same type of strategy for germ warfare to kill off the indigenous people there by saying that they have AIDS, or is AIDS itself a germ warfare tactic?
Very good question, Professor Wilder.
Okay, I'm going to handle that in two separate ways. I think what he's referring to in the 18th century, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, which ends in 1763, General Jeffrey Amherst in New York, in a sequence of letters with Colonel Henry Bouquet, one of his underlings, devises a plan to spread smallpox-infected blankets among the Western Indians, who've started a pan-Indian resistance movement on the Western frontier. And part of Amherst's strategy for dealing with this is actually an attempt to spread smallpox-infected blankets. And so it's not directly related to vaccines. It's actually related to an attempt to spread smallpox by spreading smallpox-infected materials among those populations. And I'm going to leave the question of vaccination separate. There is, in fact, a relationship to vaccination in the book, but not the one that the caller is actually asking about. In the book, one of the things I point out is that the early science of vaccination is one in which enslaved Africans become actually particularly important. For example, Cotton Mather, who we talked about earlier, the Harvard graduate and Puritan intellectual, learns about vaccination from the enslaved man, the enslaved boy, who he was given. As that young man grows up, he teaches Mather the art of vaccination as it was used in Africa. And Mather then actually has a local doctor here in Boston, Zebediah Boylston, engage in an experiment in vaccination in which Boylston uses his children and his slaves as the subject of that experiment.
Right. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question, caller. Professor Wilder, I want to thank you so much for coming on air with us. And before I let you go, let people know where your book can be purchased.
Okay. Yeah, it's Ebony and Ivy, and it can be purchased online through the large book distributors like Amazon and Ebony. I'm sorry, I was about to repeat the title, and Barnes & Noble. But also it can be purchased in university bookstores and in your local bookstores. I'm always a big fan of using local bookstores, and so I always look there first, and I encourage other people to do the same.
Very good, Professor Wilder. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday. Fascinating interview. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate you coming aboard with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. And you have a fantastic rest of your Sunday, okay?
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.